This week's topic is ribs, ribs, ribs. So everything's about ribs, okay?
Spare ribs or rib ribs?
Ribs, 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 spare ribs, and more ribs.
Oh, all right.
Okay, everything's ribs. We're going to talk about ribs, ribs, ribs. What we want to do is go out to the pit. We'll show you what we're doing there, and then we'll come in, and I've got some handouts and got some of the fresh ribs and kind of show you where those are located. So let's all move out to the pit. Okay, the first ribs we're going to talk about are the pork ribs, and what we fixed today, we fixed back ribs and St. Louis style ribs. Okay, now the back ribs come from the loin area, and the St. Louis ribs come from the side of pork. Now last week I talked about the spare ribs. Well, from the spare ribs, if we cut the sternum and the costal cartilage off so that we have just the ribs, that's what we call the St. Louis style ribs. So these here are the St. Louis style rib. These are the back rib. The back ribs are a little smaller bone. They have more curve to them. See how these are curved, and then these are flat. Okay, so that's how we can distinguish the difference there. Also, the back ribs, a little meatier. Generally, from a price standpoint, the back ribs will be more expensive than the spare ribs or the St. Louis style rib. So over here, what do we have right here? What kind of ribs are those? Huh? What do you think? St. Louis style rib. Okay. What are these right here? Back ribs. Hey, very good. Now another thing that we want to talk about, and there's always great debate on which is better, dry ribs or wet ribs. Our dry ribs, and dry ribs are very popular in Memphis. If you go to Memphis, go down the places they advertise their dry ribs. A Rendezvous is one of the places that is popular because of their dry ribs there in Memphis. The dry rib, we've seasoned those with a hotter spice. We rubbed them yesterday, let them set in it overnight, and have just put these on the fire and left them all day. So that's what we talk about when we're talking about dry ribs. The wet ribs, we've used a sweet barbecue rub seasoning, and then for about the last hour and a half, we started applying the famous Dr. Sable barbecue sauce. So if y'all remember that from before, it's like candy, and it's very, very sweet, very, very good. So we'll have the difference in the wet and the dry. What we've got on the beef ribs, these are back ribs. So again, that's coming from the rib area of the beef. And then we have the chuck ribs. Now, we started cooking this morning about 8:30. And because the beef ribs were thicker, we started them on this end of the pit. Well, this is also the hottest end of the pit. So we actually got these, I'll say, burnt. Okay, but I think they'll still be all right if we trim a little bit of that off. They should still be okay. And that's one of the things you've got to deal with if you're cooking on a pit like this. Anything that's closer to the fire, you're going to get more heat. And another thing you had to do, Michael had to go to class, and there was nobody here to man the pit to make sure that didn't happen. So again, I think they'll still be tasteful. Hopefully they'll be tender. Again, this is the chuck chuck ribs, and these are the beef back rib. The seasoning that we used on those was just 50% kosher salt and 50% black pepper. And that's the seasoning we used on those. So let's go in, and I've got these fresh, and we've got the skeleton in there, and we'll talk about where these ribs come from. And while we're doing that, the curvature, the curve in it that the back ribs have. Okay. Now, as far as location and where those are located on the carcass, when we go through fabrication, we're going to leave 5 ribs in the chuck. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We separate the rib and the chuck right here between the 5th and 6th ribs. So these back ribs are going to be located right here. Okay. So you can see the curve. You can see that they're narrower where it's up near the backbone. So that's our beef back ribs. Our chuck short ribs come from right in this area, right in here. Okay? You can see they're a little meatier. They're meatier than the back ribs. And then the ribs are flatter and then also wider. Okay? And then you can get other ribs. You can get short ribs that kind of come from the plate. So the ribs here, the plates down here, so that you get the short ribs, the chuck short ribs. So there's variations. If you look, probably the 2 most popular that you'll see are the beef back ribs and the chuck short ribs. The chuck short ribs are really starting to show up more and more in our Texas barbecue establishment. Okay, now we're going to turn Bossy into a pig. Okay, so we're going to go down a little bit. This set of ribs is going to come from the other side. See if I can flip her around maybe. Okay. So this is the spare ribs. Okay, it comes, remember last week we had a side of pork and we talked about coming from the side or the belly. Here we have the sternum. So you can see the sternum right there. And then down on the ends of this, the tips of this spare ribs, you have costal cartilage. So now Bossy was 20-something years old, and no longer did she have cartilage there. That cartilage had ossified and turned to bone. But you see these little connections down here? That's what we refer to as costal cartilage. So on a pork carcass, we separate the shoulder from the loin by cutting between the first and second rib. So our first rib would be right in there. There's your sternum. Okay. And then you have your costal cartilage down here. To make the St. Louis ribs, we just come in here, knock off the sternum, knock off the costal cartilage. So again, if this was a big set of spare ribs here, well, we'd come right along there, knocking the sternum and the costal cartilage off to make our St. Louis style rib. The back ribs, again, on the pork, will come from the pork loin. Okay, so the spare ribs, the St. Louis ribs, come from the pork side. The back ribs are going to come from the pork loin. Okay. Other ribs that are popular from pork are your country style ribs. The country style ribs generally come from the Boston butt, or you can find them where they've actually come from the blade portion of the pork loin. Okay, so what they're doing here is they're in the process of cutting up the ribs. So these are the St. Louis style that you've got.
I got St. Louis.
You've got St. Louis?
No, I got baby back.
You got baby back and you got St. Louis. And both of these are dry, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So what we'll do here in a minute when they come through is encourage you to take one rib of each group. On the dry ribs, we use the same rub, both the back ribs and the St. Louis style rib. For the wet ribs, we used a sweeter dry rub, and then the sauce that we glazed those with was very sweet. We started the glazing about an hour and a half to 2 hours before we took them off. Was it an hour or hour and a half? Hour and a half before we took them off the grill. So we had them setting there and then started about every 10 or 15 minutes, started sopping them with the sweet barbecue sauce. There is different methods. Some people wrap them, some people don't. We actually, once these got to being done, we wrapped them in peach paper. Now, peach paper is kind of like a butcher paper. It's not a waxed butcher paper, but it's a butcher paper. With that, the difference in that and aluminum foil, they're really not able to breathe in, and you kind of create a sauna there, and you really start steaming them. And if there's a number of methods. Some people talk about 3-2-1. So 3-2-1 ribs, you leave them unwrapped for 3 hours, then you wrap them for 2 hours, and then you take them off for 1 hour. When we had our summer barbecue camp, one of the pit masters there said he used 2-2-2. So he would cook them for 2 hours, wrap them for 2 hours, and then without wrap for 2 hours. A lot of times, if you're using aluminum foil, you'll actually get them, in my opinion, too tender. So you want it to come off the bone very easily, but you don't want it just to fall off the bone. You want a little bite to it. So somewhere in there's a magical point of where they're too tender versus being just right. As far as the temperatures, again, we tried to cook these around 225. So we tried to keep our grill around 225. Again, the wrapping, if you use the aluminum foil, a lot of times it's like steaming them. And while they're sitting in there creating their own steam, well, that steam is going to convert that collagen to gelatin and will actually make them more tender. Peach paper keeps the heat in. They create a little bit of steam, but it's able to breathe more than being trapped in that aluminum foil. Everybody may not want to, they'll go further that way.
We got another knife, Berto?
Thanks, sir.
These are just heavy bark.
Yeah, it's heavy bark. Your money where your mouth is. Gooder? Did I say that?
We learned a lot of different things in class today. We learned that there were different cuts of ribs, and that
There's a difference between wet and dry barbecue.
So I learned that there are such things as wet and dry ribs. I'd only ever had dried and then added like seasonings and stuff to it afterwards, and so I thought that was really cool. They were actually the ones I liked best. So that was
Yeah, and then the same thing, and then I also learned that ribs come from cattle and pork. I did not know that.
like the wet ribs, and I think it was the St. Louis ribs that were good. It's just like the sweeter ribs are better to me. So
I really like the wet ones too, especially the sweet one, which I think it was pork.
yeah,
And
the pork ribs.
it was, sweet wet rib.
So my favorite today would probably be the baby back wet pork ribs, but also the beef chuck was really, really good. I liked the bark.
Yeah, the same thing. The wet was really good. The wet baby back pork. It was super tender.
The barbecue class is that, well, first of all, we get to eat and it's like our Friday dinners. But we get to like just kind of hang out with a bunch of friends, and it's a lot of fun and just kind of a chill class. So
My favorite part is the food. I really like.
Favorite part would definitely be the food and the free gifts that we get every week. So yeah.
I think it's a great way to end the week. Like, if you haven't really, I look forward to this at the end of every week. It's a great way to get to like small environment. You get to actually talk to everyone, and then the food, and actually learning a bit more about it too.